Hi there. I'm Javid Moosaji. I'm here with Jim Nadackal from Goblin. Goblin is an enterprise SaaS company, and Jim has kindly agreed to join me and to be interviewed to discuss a couple of points. So basically, to give a bit of a background to this session, I've set up this session with some key people in my network to discuss some key interesting topics. Interesting topics such as how do you start up a business, what are the trends today in respective industries, how do we leverage strategic partnerships or M&A integrations or digital transformation. So some interesting topics, and actually it's a very open forum. We want to be able to ask questions to our interviewees, but also for them to be able to address certain topics in their industry. So a bit of background for myself. I've spent over 15 years in the payments and FX services industry, touching on M&A integration, digital transformation, and also partnerships. So some interesting topics that we want to talk about today are, things around how can you start up a business. So Jim has had a lot of experience around that. So I wanted to quiz Jim on such topics and also anything happening today in the industry. So with that said, I'll hand over to Jim to introduce himself and a little bit about his role today.
Hey, Javid. So absolutely thrilled to be on the show. And a bit about myself, right? So I currently am the co-founder and CEO of Goblin Application Performance Monitoring. It's essentially a SaaS tool that helps any company that relies on mobile apps to interact with its customers to really optimize the customer experience from the performance point of view, right? So that people don't face these glitches and frozen screens or things acting slowly where they shouldn't, all those kind of stuff. So that's what I do now. So it's a startup that I founded with my co-founder Fanindra, and we've been at it for less than a year now, about half a year now, and it's really going great. Right. And prior to that, I've more than 17 years of corporate experience. So I'm kind of new to the startup world. I come, I was somewhat similar background to you in a sense that I've spent a lot of time in financial services on the digital side, on managing digital ways of engaging with customers for large corporations, be it Western Union, Tesco, large telcos with a global footprint. So I did that for many years of my life. And right now I'm at that stage where some of the problems that we've seen across enterprises and startups when it comes to actually providing a great customer experience digitally, some of those problems are what we are trying to address in a SaaS manner so that companies can focus on what they excel at as their core competence while we enable them to deliver great technical experiences, right? So that's a bit about me, about what I do. And it's as I said, it's really, really great to be on this show. So
Thank you so much, Jim. And listen, I heard some really interesting themes there coming up. So you talked about customer experience, the customer engagement, and also one that's actually really interesting right now is how do you start up a business? And I think you're quite, as you said, you're new to starting up a business. But having said that, I know you've also experienced startups, and not only in Asia, but you've also done some startups in the UK and also in Africa, if memory serves me right. So I think whilst you're quite new to startups, I think you can bring to the table some of the experiences, and it's not easy to start up a business, right? We all know that there are challenges in starting up a business, not only in getting the funding, but also coming up with the idea, putting the operating model together, finding the other partners. So you're doing a bit of everything in a startup. And so what would be good to kind of understand a little bit from your side, Jim, what were some of the challenges you experienced when you were setting up a business? And are there any particular advice maybe you want to share with the audience today who might be thinking of starting up a business today?
Yeah, so as you said, this is my first startup, but I've started a couple of businesses which are not venture capital backed startups, right? So, and every time, so about entrepreneurship in general, my experience has been that so this is my third company I'm starting, and I've had a success and a failure in the past. And so what I've experienced and what I've learned is that every time you do, you get better at some parts of it, and some things are always new learning, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like there's a there's a formula that magically works, and that is also what makes it really interesting. Because if you're by nature someone who is curious and interested in solving problems, working with people, and working at scale,
Right.
startups are like one of the I can't think of anything better than starting a business when it comes to that point of it, right? Because there's so much, there's no, there's very few things I'd say that are repetitive, right? So there's always new learning. There's always new solutions you come up with that actually add value to people, and you can also experience it a lot more directly about the change you make to people's lives. So that's one reason why I think everybody should, at some point in their lives, try starting a business, or
Yeah.
engage even in some other ways, like as mentors, or or board advisors. In whatever ways, engaging with startups is, I think, really a very positive thing to do. And right now, I think it's probably one of the, I'd say, the best and the worst time to be a startup, right? Because because we are all going through this unprecedented global crisis, right? So, and
Right.
what that means is that there are challenges which none of us have faced before, right? And there are also problems that none of us have faced before
Face
that need to
before.
be solved for. So as a startup, you can solve for those problems probably quicker than others, if you think about it, because you're much more agile and much more in touch with the people. So if you look at the population, there are a lot of significant issues that everybody is going through,
Right.
which now is a great time to solve them. The challenges also are, from everybody's busy dealing with their own stuff, so it's a tough time to acquire customers. It's a tough time to, raise funding. It's a tough time to just have a meeting and shake hands and close a deal. And it's as
Yeah, no,
simple as that.
absolutely. I've got, classic example right now. I've got my cat in the background that's actually meowing.
Yeah,
So, and I've done a couple of these interviews with people, and you can start to see, hey, they're forced to actually start working from home, right? So these
yeah,
are unprecedented times, and you have to have more and more meetings that are taking place from home. So, and that comes with the entire baggage, right? So all the noise in the background with that.
yeah,
So, hey, so Jim, you've talked about some really key things there, and I think one that that strikes me is that continuous ability, or having this ability to be a little bit agile in your thinking as you're starting up a business. So you talked about finding new solutions, and you talked about solving new problems, and I think from some at least from my experience, when I'm looking at startups and speaking and reading through people who've gone through startups, you kind of always start with an idea in your head, and as you're moving through and trying to put that and set that up and put it into an execution, those ideas sometimes and the problems tend to morph as you're going along, right? Specifically in a very dynamic environment. So maybe the idea that you started up with is not always the one that you end up implementing, right? Is that something that you mean when you talk about new problems and new solutions? So as you're going along, is it a bit of a trial and error, and you might end up with a gold pot of something that wasn't originally intended.
Yeah, so that's a big part of the agility, right? In the sense of um, one thing which one thing which is super critical is to be very open and honest about the reality of your customers, right? So if I talk a bit about what we do is we help mobile app developers understand exactly the root causes of any issue that their users face, right? So that's we've all experienced this.
Yeah.
So you have an app, it doesn't work, it crashes, or a screen pops up which you didn't expect it to, work a certain way, or you're just trying to check out, and the payment takes too much time, or get an unexpected error. All these kind of things happen, right? So this is a problem which everybody faces, and typically companies have a way of solving it, because there are currently some tooling out there. People work around, build their own tooling or instrumentation, like any good engineer would do to solve these problems, right? One of the interesting things that we are seeing right now is that with the remote work that's happening, lot of the problem solving happens through human interaction.
Right.
And even companies that have large remote teams, or teams geographically in different places, had certain reliance on some people physically working in a certain manner to do stuff, right? And also another thing what we are seeing with customers is that while everybody used to work from home, now it's a different time. People are actually also doing childcare. People are also doing cooking and cleaning, and they're essentially living they're doing two jobs a lot more. Actually maintaining your house, like we spoke earlier about, you're having a roofing issue, and that's
Right.
one of those things that you don't get someone to come and help you. You have to actually fix it yourself. So there's
Yes.
a lot of DIY, there's a lot of childcare, there's a lot of pet care, there's a lot of housekeeping that everybody's doing, and that itself reduces the ability people have to do extra work on dealing with issues on apps they manage, for example. And so we can see that people are all of a sudden seeing value in outsourcing that to a tool, or
Right.
basically for everybody has just enough bandwidth to focus on what they really have to do as a core job, because there's not much time for anything else. And this whole working from your home, everybody is coming to a realization that it's not some romantic ideal, right? It's actually a lot of grunt work. So with that, so we are seeing that what that means for us is there are things we changed in our roadmap, or even in our approach to customers over the last 1.5 months. So initially, typically like most SaaS startups do, we were focusing very much on startups and other small companies which would not have development time or resource to allocate to the kind of problems we solve for, right?
Yeah.
But now what we are seeing is even with enterprises, which currently have large IT teams and ways of doing these things, even they are, more willing, or actually more keen, I would say, to look for solutions like ours. And they were, so some of the, as a startup, what that means for me is there were some features which were enterprise features, or some features which were, which were not really that important earlier, which have become more important. And so I changed my roadmap. And there's some things which were, quite very important, like I'd say in February, which have become less important. For example, people are, for example, I see much more willing to pick up and use a less, a less appealing user interface. I see it mostly when it comes to remote working tools. There are quite a few that are really picking up, not the likes of Zoom, but there are a lot of small ones that are picking up, because the product does a really good job. It may not be the slickest thing to look at, but it does a really good job. And even in our case, what we've seen is, people are looking at a lot more at functionality of solving a real problem,
right,
than peripherals. So peripherals have become less important. User experience matters a lot, but the cosmetics of user experience matter a bit less. Uh, but the functional capabilities that any product can deliver in actually solving a real functional problem, those have become a lot more important. So if you are like a fancy, nice to have thing, you immediately go, get deprioritized, you go away. So there are a lot of these things happen.
Right.
So the important thing, going back to your question, there is how do you trace it all back to constantly being honest with yourselves about what the reality is?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
the moment the moment you become too wedded to this is how your product should be, or this is how people should be, you're essentially closing doors to a lot of possibilities, right? And that's something I have almost a side-by-side comparison, having worked for corporations and now, working for a startup. What I see is when you're a small startup with not much resources to, depend on, and absolutely zero time to waste, even a minute wasted really weighs you down heavily on, I could have done better today, right? So that's
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
constant sense of, am I doing my best as a startup founder? What I've seen is that um, what really helps you marry those two pieces is essentially how true you stay to the customer, right? How
Fantastic.
honest are
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
what do customers really care about? That's and situations like now when even any little bit of fat that was on on the processes have to be really shaved off, is forcing that for
To
everybody.
happen.
And
Yeah. Now, listen, that's some really interesting observations and experience there, and something that maybe large corporations should be adopting today, right? And possibly, coming into this pandemic and coming out of it, I'm sure a lot of organizations will look internally to say, okay, how can we do things a lot better, and how can we be a lot more customer centric, right? I really like the point you make around firstly being honest to yourself, and being honest to yourself actually means, well, what does the customer really want, from an experience standpoint, and also what problem they're trying to address themselves, right? And that's really some interesting points. And it's a good segue into some of the following questions around, a lot of organizations today are going to be compelled to digitalize a lot of their processes, but also a lot of their offering and their propositions, right? We are
yeah,
starting to see a big shift from retail into digital. And obviously the strange times in which we're living right now is going to accelerate that piece. And it's actually interesting because suddenly we're starting to see barriers that were, been put up over the number of years, whether that be from a customer's perspective or from an organizational internal processes, are suddenly coming down really fast, in order
yeah,
to make way for these digital experiences, right? So some of the the changes and the resistance to changes have suddenly disappeared in the space of 4 weeks, right? And you can see these challenges were there for like years, and resistance to adoption for years, and suddenly over 4 weeks, everybody's okay having to do this. So I think, it's quite important that you stay true to the customer experience. Absolutely, I think that's a very important thing. What are maybe some of the challenges you think these traditional organizations have today in adopting some of these digital experiences, right? And we know that suddenly some of them will naturally and will be forced into these experiences, but nevertheless there'll be some challenges for some traditional organizations. Um, can you maybe do you have any in mind, and maybe any advice of maybe how these organizations can overcome some of these, particularly when they're moving to a digital kind of an experience?
yeah. So that's a great question, and because that touches on quite a lot of the struggles I've uh, faced in the past, and all of us who work in digital transformation, who have worked in digital transformation in large corporations face, right? Which is there are, and people are usually tend to put this down on terms like, say, mindset, culture, things like, but it's actually not. Those are, I think, sometimes a bit too lazy or like a
You're
too
right.
peripheral answer.
Yeah.
The real challenge in large corporations I've always faced and still will face is there's a there's a reason why things are done a certain way, right? And so there's so if you look at payments, or if you look at shopping, or any or money movement through mobile wallets, so any of, without going into specific examples, any of the problems I've worked on solving, sometimes a lot of these they rely heavily on some legacy processes. So when a large corporate entity does the so-called digital transformation, or even if you look at fintech in general, right?
Right.
Even a lot of the startups in the space, essentially what it does is there are so much of legacy processes which exist for a reason, and a very valid reason, and which provide a lot of value, which can't be like overnight changed.
Yeah.
So what happens is most of the transformative solutions, so to speak, actually transform the interaction layer, or the skin of the experience of how people interact with a bank or a retailer or something.
Yeah.
But it may not be able to change all the underlying processes, because these are not built bottom up. So what I've seen when uh, my learning after many years of working in digital teams in different settings is that there is there's always a higher chance of success when a corporation is quite honest about it. Okay, there are these actual underlying rails which we have a certain way, and we may not be able to change them, and we may not need to change them. How can we use it as an advantage to enable a digital process? So for example, I may have a certain way of moving money, and I may have, like in a payments
Yeah.
scheme, right? So there might be some really strong risk management capabilities there. There might be some really strong ability to clear and move money across currencies, across multiple geographies really quickly. So that is actually a strength. So whenever I've looked at, if you look at the fintech space, there are companies, startups and corporations which have managed to say, okay, let's keep that. That doesn't need to overnight change. How can I remove the pain points in the customer interaction by providing, by making that smoother, by making that digital,
Yeah.
while I do some of the fulfillment in a different way, and then slowly change it. So I think that's a real critical thing.
So do you think, Jim, there's a risk of, and I think I've heard this term quite a lot, is around using that approach, there's a risk of you just doing a kind of ending up in the digital lipstick syndrome piece, right? Where you're just digitalizing a front end element or an experience of it, but your back end, particularly when it comes to supply chains and the back office, you can't extract the real value of that if that's not digitalized. Today we're experiencing, because of the pandemic, where people can't always show up to work, supply chains are even a lot more stressed, right? And are hitting this. So this is the time where we should be thinking about digitalizing not only one element of the process, but try to figure out how you can digitalize the entire end-to-end process, which then makes for a better customer experience further down the line. But I appreciate that there are a lot of legacy processes there which will not be able to be, digitalized overnight, right?
Yeah.
And that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost, and it also comes with, do you have the right skill sets in house to look at these kind of things, right? And
Yeah.
for me, I think what I'm finding quite interesting right now is, particularly when it comes to digital transformation with traditional organizations, is around their capability. And tying back to the point that you talked about, how can you be honest with yourself, right? And the first thing about being honest with yourself, I think, is, well, what, as an organization, what am I really good at, right? And so what am I good at? What are my key competencies and capabilities? Um, because I find out a lot of organizations are trying to portray and give us, a sense of their capabilities to the market when they don't truly understand their customer base and the subgroups of their customers, and then what capabilities they need to embrace in order to serve those customers, right? So I think we're going to see potentially more and more, and I'm hoping that will be the case, where a lot of these companies who internalize and then think, okay, what am I good at? If I'm not good at something, can I start thinking about the right strategic partnerships with people who are good at this, right? So if you haven't got a great, supply chain, okay, do I go and partner with somebody who's got that? Or if I haven't got a great front end experience, do I build it, or do I go and acquire a company to go and do that? Or do I actually start partnering with the right organizations? And sometimes strategic partnership is a cheaper way to go and test something, and to test something with people who actually have experience in that domain and who know about this, right? So I'm hoping that coming out of this pandemic, we're going to start to see a lot more collaboration with, strategic partners, right? Who can start to create the right ecosystems across companies, right? Because if you look at today, I don't think, and I know speaking with Nitin Kumar, I think, who kind of I introduced you to, who's got a lot of experience in business models and M&A, and he was just saying, hey, the serial and M&A acquirer doesn't exist anymore, and that's true. If you go out, I can't think of a large business that's a serial acquirer today, right? Because the whole landscape is changing. And today it's more about purchasing, digital skill sets, digital technologies, and doesn't necessarily require an acquisition. You could go out and do an alliance or do a strategic partnership with these guys. And it's probably a better way to go out and test something, right? And less costly to do that. And if it does work, then you can then think of, okay, do I get a more control over that organization, and then think of an acquisition. But at that time, you probably would have overcome all these complexities around integration, people, and all of that, right? So I think it's an interesting time where digital transformation is also going through a bit of a rethink, right? And I'm hoping to see a lot of an explosion around some of these partnerships.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting couple of things you mentioned about. One, about the ecosystem partnerships and versus M&A, right? So the thing is, the serial acquirer model sometimes works. We see that happening a lot in fintech. For example, we've seen quite a lot of consolidation and acquisitions happen in the fintech and payments area, right? So whether it's Visa acquiring Plaid, or like if you look at the WorldPays and the GPSs of the world, there's a lot of consolidation happening in that space. So there's a pretty clear play happening, and so there are some industries where it is possible to partner or merge or consolidate in a certain way because of the modular nature of the problem. I think it's almost a very engineering way in which I'm explaining this. But if you think about it, if you look at payments, it's a stack. There are different layers to the stack, and there are people who take care of distribution. There are people who take care of acquiring. There are people who take care of, merchants. So there are, and these all are quite modular, and they can connect with each other. And some of which are very legacy, but some of which are not. So I think what we have seen in the fintech world is that there have been players who have got the problem solving and the customer experience right at different parts of it. Yeah. And some of them are coming together in really interesting ways. But if you go to the e-commerce and logistics supply chain example, right, one of the biggest problems that COVID-19 has exposed is that e-commerce is not, in most cases, built for all for an all e-commerce world, for lack
Yeah.
of a better, for lack of a better phrase there. So, a lot of it relies on supply chains that either there are two models. Right? One you could be fulfilling from the warehouse of a typical brick and mortar store. That
Right.
happens a lot in grocery retail and many other areas. Or it could be built very much in a highly efficient supply chain model, right? Where it is, if you look at a lot of these supply chains, they're quite efficient, but they're not that good at being responsive, right? So supermarkets, for example, are amazing at efficiency and responsiveness. So one of the reasons why nobody has really struggled for food is, if you look at the supermarket supply chain, it actually is quite, it can scale up and down quite quickly in terms of, people could do panic buying and stock out a store. But there's a way of replenishing that quite quickly, and that's fascinating if you think about some of the produce is eventually coming from continents that are many hours of flight away, right? So there's some areas where the balance of efficiency and responsiveness have been really, really well thought through. So those supply chains have not failed, and we may not even appreciate the fact that we all still have food.
Yeah.
And this food is not coming from the back end. So that complex logistics is taken care of. But there are some other supply chains where they have not been built in terms of everything from where you place the warehouses to where the actual tooling that you use for taking care of fulfillments. Those may not be built for scale or built for responsibility. So what we see currently, even in what we do, just a little aside, right? So we see there are a lot of internal apps that or workflow apps that are not, because we are in the apps world, and you might think of, when you say apps, you might think of Facebook or Twitter or maybe a banking app. But there are a lot of apps that are used by the guy who picks up a package from a warehouse and scans it and marks it as delivered. And so there's this entire ecosystem of products or workflow apps out there, which have their own challenges, because they're all designed to work with certain work. And so then you see, all of a sudden there's a stock out in a warehouse or something or other. So the logistics chain is designed for something. Then you see the app ecosystem, the digital tooling is designed for something. Everything starts, exposing its issues. So one amazing thing, what I see with times like this, like what you mentioned earlier, the ecosystems and the relationships between the players and how they partner or M&A, and a lot of will all change, because a lot of the things we took for granted, we are seeing that we can't really take them for granted. There are these underlying assumptions which we had, which were all built not for a digital execution. They were all built by, like I said earlier, some legacy system, sometimes readapted. I don't. So the one thing I really want to reiterate here, and the one point I want everybody to get here, is that adapting a physical system is not always bad. It has worked quite well, or there have been brick and mortar systems repurposed quite well in the payments and banking world. And and I've seen, we all have seen some really good M&As, really good partnerships happening in that space. But there are also areas where systems have been built that are not built to scale, that are not built for a digital execution. Those will change. It's going to be a very, very interesting.
And I think it's important also to appreciate, when it comes to M&A, depends on what the play is, right? Sometimes there's a bit of an offensive and a defensive play there, where organizations acquire another organization just to get rid of competition, as opposed to let me go and extract value from that organization, right? So I'm just also conscious of bit of time, but I wanted to touch on the obviously the COVID-19 and a bit of the pandemic that's happening today. We're hearing a lot of constant information on, or negative information around the pandemic, which is absolutely understandable, right? Given that it has an adverse impact on businesses and on personal lives. But I wanted to probably take a slightly different spin on this to say, what are some of the positive things that might come out of this pandemic, right? So, for example, for me at a personal level, yes, I'm now, cooped up at home over a month, coming to nearly 2 months. But what does it mean for me, and how has it impacted me? There are some positive things to this. So it's given me a little bit more time to pause and to think about some of the more important things that I want to achieve. It's given me time to focus on certain areas that I didn't have time, for example, exercising a little bit more and stopping to be a little bit lazy, right? So these are some of the things that's forcing you to think about, well, hold on, did I actually need to pay to go to a gym? There's a lot of things I can do at home, right? Will I ever go back to a gym, or will I continue working from home? Do I learn to be a little bit more proactive? To balance my personal life with work, right? So there are certain positive things that might be coming out of this. At a business level, I think it's forcing us to probably think about being a little bit more and accelerate a little bit those efficiencies and the more efficient operating models, right? Are there any other positive things? I can think of, for example, hey. The world slowing down and pausing, does that have a positive impact on, the levels of pollution, for example? We see less cars and things like that. So there might be some positive things coming out of this pandemic. And do you think we can maybe continue to leverage those positive things and further for post-pandemic?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixed bag, right? So what the pandemic, I think, has done is, I would say, again, it has kept us honest, right? And it has kind of exposed a lot about what is really important and what we can do without, right? So what I expect as an outcome is, so let me just take an example here. If you look at education, people have realized that a lot of education can happen online, right?
Yes.
But people have also realized that a big part of what schools do is childcare. So when it comes to me learning a skill on, say, machine learning, I don't probably need to go to university for that. There are probably other ways in which I can do it. But when it comes to a child learning how to count, probably the child can learn at home, but there's a whole other function in terms of socialization, in terms of childcare, in terms of well-being that a school serves. So what if you ask a very first principles question about what does education do? And if you go a step back into even more similar first principle questions like, what does a school do? What is our definition of a school might change. Definition of a university might change. And some of it would be really positive, and some of it would be about discontinuing something which are not necessary. So I think if everybody studies from home all the time, people may end up with poorer social skills.
Yes.
And and I face this a lot even now. As I said, when it comes to the startup ecosystem that I'm part of, we're able to do a lot of things online, right? Because generally, the ecosystem that I'm part of, we were all always remote in some way. We are all always used to working a lot on the in a distributed remote.
You were digital by nature.
Yeah, we're digital by nature. So
Yeah,
we are used to working with people who are geographically in different places, and we are used to also working on complex stuff remotely, right? So that forces us to communicate in a manner that can travel in writing or a PowerPoint presentation or on a face-to-face. So some of those things haven't changed. However, we're also realizing that there are certain elements where the face-to-face adds a lot of value. So when it comes to even like a Zoom call, if I'm talking to a customer over Zoom, there's always a part where we don't really see how they are responding to a
yeah,
certain thing, because there's only so much video can do. There's no water coolers and coffee
yeah,
machine
yeah.
conversations, right?
I think the chemistry is not always
Yeah,
transferred across, right, when through the digital experience.
yeah.
Um, hey,
Those things will, again, there'll be a lot of fascinating things which come there, some positive, some negative. Overall, I'm very, very optimistic, because human beings always will find the best out of everything and then take it forward. I'm super optimistic when it comes to that.
no, no, that's good, and I think it's a natural thing, right? So I think humans by nature, we don't realize this, are quite adaptive, right?
Yeah,
As a species in nature, that if you look at history, we are quite adaptive. It's quite
yeah,
strange that suddenly we've introduced concepts around, oh, we need to resist, or resistance to change and things like that. But if you think about it at its core,
yeah,
mankind has always adapted
yeah,
throughout any situation, right?
yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting thing. But I'm hoping that there are some positive things that we can take from this pandemic, and leverage that going forward, to better both ourselves as an individual and obviously businesses. Jim, a final question, just even throwing out there, what are some of the big trends that you're seeing in your space? So, for example, in the payments world, or in generally cross-border payments, FX world, digitalization is a key thing. Personalization, particularly around consumer experiences. How do we leverage, data? So obviously artificial intelligence, and you mentioned machine learning there. These are some of the things that are going to be, I think, increasingly important as we move forward in a lot of industries, right? And I think these are. But just from your top things, what are some of the watch points that you probably would want this audience to hear?
Yeah, so what I would expect to see happening would be a real boom in edge computing or IoT, or or whatever you call it. There would be a lot more stuff, because today that happens at at the edge, as we call it. Because today, when we think of digital, it's essentially mobile apps and browsers.
Yeah,
But you do something on a browser, on your computer, or use an app for that, right? But that's actually just a very small part of what the internet would be, right? Internet is just at its infancy, is one way of thinking about it, and a lot more stuff moving to. If you look at some of the challenges we face with the current mode of being, doing stuff in a digital manner, a lot of it has to do with the medium we are using, which is a computer or a phone. Or, it's not essentially the best way of solving this. So we expect some significant shifts in that area. We expect some significant, changes in how B2B businesses work, right? And a lot of which, again, as a startup in that space, we are on the long term extremely optimistic about some of these changes and what that impacts our business of application performance monitoring through Goblin directly. But also we know that, like any of these changes in history, there'll be a period of pain, because there'll be a lot of back and forth,
of
and
course.
then a new equilibrium would be found. But I think how we interact with devices and how we interact with consumption, versus contribution through digital media will dramatically change. Because currently, let's be honest, most of it is consumption.
Yeah.
People are watching stuff or entertainment and something, and that will keep on happening, right? But there'll be a lot of this back and forth interaction stuff, a lot of production, contribution, creation that's happening through digital, media, and that won't be just typing into a browser, thing, or it won't be typing something into a phone. It will be quite a different world, and that's something I'm really excited about.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Jim, listen, thank you so much for sharing your experiences around starting up a business and, obviously digital transformation. And listen, I hope to kind of speak to you again and invite you back on to share more experiences with myself and with the audience. I know for a fact that I've always enjoyed speaking with you and bouncing a few ideas with yourself, which is quite valuable to me. So thank you so much for your time today, Jim. And hope to see you soon again.
Thanks a lot, Javid. Thanks for having me. I absolutely enjoyed this conversation and looking forward to more of them in the future. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Take care,
Take
Jim.
care. Bye.
Bye.